before I introduce our speaker for today, I want to acknowledge Avery Goldstein, who's not here, and the Center for the Study of Contemporary China at Penn, most of whom are also not here, for their financial assistance in bringing Christine Wong all the way from Melbourne to talk to us today. The reason that the China people are not here is that they're having a two-day conference running yesterday and today on new media, the internet, and changing China. And it's going on in the Gillen Amphitheater in James Hall. And we're awaiting a blob of these folks to wend their way here. As I understand it, their morning adventures concluded at noon. So there may be a few of them filtering in over the next few minutes. But I thought we should probably go ahead and get started with introductions, if nothing else. So, about our speaker, we're very happy to have Christine Wong with us today. She's a professor of Chinese Studies at the University of Melbourne, where she also directs the Center for Contemporary Chinese Studies, which I gather is a fairly new center there, is that right? Yeah, so you've got startup, may have a little bit of the startup blues or the startup excitements, I'm not sure which. Professor Wong is a leading authority on Chinese public finance and central local relations, and also on public policy in China generally. We asked her to come speak to the DCC workshop today because her research has really important implications for human welfare and social rights in China, the world's most populous country and second largest economy. For us to have a faculty seminar on social rights and citizenship and not talk about China would be a fairly glaring oversight. Professor Wong's training is in economics. She has her PhD from the University of California, Berkeley. I promise that's not why we invited her. I didn't learn that until later. Before moving to Australia in 2014, Professor Wong was professor of Chinese public finance and the director of Chinese studies at Oxford University. Before that, she was on the faculty of the University of Washington at Seattle and UC Santa Cruz and Mount Holyoke. So she's done her time in academia. However, from 1997 to 2000, Professor Wong took some time away from the Ivory Tower, serving as senior economist at the World Bank in their poverty reduction and economic management unit in the East Asia and Pacific region. Professor Wong has also held senior staff positions at the Asian Development Bank and has consulted with the IMF, the UNDP, UNICEF, and DFID. And in 2012, she was appointed to the OECD's advisory panel on budgeting and public expenditures. So, as you can tell, this is someone who is not only sort of widely respected within academia for her training and expertise, but who also has a real ear among policymakers, which is terrific. Now, as for our discussant today, our discussant is Yuhua Wong. As is our custom, we've sought out a discussant who knows the substantive area of the presentation very well, but who comes at it from a slightly different disciplinary perspective. Yuhua Wong is an assistant professor of political science and also a faculty affiliate of the Center for the Study of Contemporary China here at Penn. His own research focuses on how political economy reforms in China have been enacted locally, contributing to a limited form of rule of law. He has a book forthcoming from Cambridge, right? Titled Tying the Autocrat's Hands, The Rise of Rule of Law in China, which examines how China's reforms and opening up have contributed to this emerging limited form of rule of law. Yuhua came to us in 2011, fresh off of a PhD in political science from the University of Michigan, and has very quickly made himself completely indispensable. So we're really lucky to have him on the faculty, and luckier still to have an opportunity to hear his expert commentary on Professor Christine Wong's work today. So I think we should probably get started, despite the fact that there may be some people filtering late, but we'll be polite to them, not boo and hiss as they stay in charge of the thing. Do you have everything you need? Okay, very good.
Okay, it's very nice to be here. I'm not used to this cold, but it's not any worse than 115 degrees, I suppose, in northern Moscow, which I also know. Now, I'm in this paper, I'm venturing slightly out of my customary area, which is public finance, public financial management. But, I also have been looking over the years at the other side of public finance, which is public expenditures, where the money goes, how it's spent, whether it's spent efficiently, effectively, and who gets it. And this paper was part of a study that was done for the World Bank on urbanization. So Premier Li Keqiang asked the World Bank to do a study of urbanization, in 3 weeks, which is very typical. And so they scrambled to find, assemble a team, and I was asked to look at inclusive services, in education and health, how to provide services to migrants. So this is the background. Let me get started. And this is also part of my work on urbanization in China, where China has urbanized very, very quickly. So since, in 2010, China officially crossed the line and became more than 50% urban. In the census, they counted up 670 million people living in cities out of 1.34 billion people. So if you look back to the beginning of China's transition to a market economy and do a little bit of subtraction, you find that the urban population has grown by 500 million in 30 years. So in 2011, there was 691 million people living in urban areas, compared to 191 million in 1980. So that's 500 million. But if you look at, and I had made the argument that China's urbanization has accelerated each year over the 35 years. But in fact, if you look at each decade, you will see in the decade, in 1980, urban population was 191 million. In 1990, it was 302, an increase of 110 million. Is there right here? Okay. So 110 million increase in that decade, 157 in the next decade, and 210. So that looks like an acceleration. So if you look at the percentage increase, the decadal increase, in each decade, basically, the urban population has grown by half on a rapidly growing pace, right? But so if we focused on these numbers, these are very rapid rates of increase in each decade. And for public finance, urbanization needs money. Urban centers, cities are very expensive. You need to build infrastructure to provide water, you have to pave roads, put in street lighting and so on to support growing neighborhoods, to provide for housing, public transport, schools, clinics, etc., etc. Somebody has to pay for it. How do you find the money? This is a big problem in developing countries. The salient characterizations of China's urbanization are the following. The scale and pace are historically unprecedented, I think. Some historian may tell me that I'm wrong, but it looks very impressive. This is something that was quite astonishing. It was financed and managed with virtually no assistance from higher level governments. And in another paper I wrote a couple of years ago, I looked at what happened. And there's no mention, there was no mention at all in the past 30 years of urban finance and how it's special or different. And central government went about its business, repairing the fiscal system, and neglected all local governments, including urban governments. And so cities were left on their own. But as a result of being left on their own to find money to do what they needed to do, central government has very few touches, and economics would be good. And so this is a very important thing I took away from that. Very little guidance and very little support. If you go to China, you see that cities are remarkably well supported by infrastructure. You know, every city you go to has, you know, new highways, new roads, schools are much better, fancier, bigger, hospitals, new hospitals being built everywhere, subway systems being built, etc. And services are essentially, you know, largely keeping up with the population growth. This is really remarkable if you compare China with other developing countries. If you go to other BRICS, India, you know, the infrastructure is pretty falling, and so on. But this is something else that happened in this process of urbanization. You know, laissez-faire urbanization under a policy regime that we might neglect. A two-tiered society has come up where there's a big divide between those with local hukou registration and those without. And those without are now 1/3 of the 600, roughly 700 million people. 1/3 of them are non-hukou residents of cities, and they have very limited access to services, the vital services. Some services you cannot exclude anyone from. Public parks, you know, public transport, things like that. But schools, healthcare, pensions require a local people to various eligibility requirements, but the non-local people are essentially excluded from that, which means that they are not part of the mainstream of urban society. And it also means that without access to these services, migrants in China, even after they've worked in cities for a long time, don't feel that they can settle permanently. And they tend to have a short horizon. There are studies that show, on average, migrants stay in cities for 8 to 9 years, which is long before they reach the peak of their productivity. And as a developing country where you need a growing skilled labor force in industry services, this is actually a big handicap for China in terms of skills deepening, skills accumulation. So the individuals who migrate don't stay long enough to reach the peak of their income capacity and their skills acquisition, and society loses out on this process as well. This is something the government is increasingly aware of. Okay. So this is the focus of my paper, is looking at how to reverse this. Among the services, I think the most divisive is likely to be education. You know, they might not have a pension, they might have to go back to rely on, you know, conventional household resources when they get old. But it's about the future generation. Their kids are not getting into, you know, the good schools. That means that their upward mobility, intergenerational mobility, is hindered, and this gets people very upset, and it should get society very upset. So in China, or rather worldwide, we recognize basic education as a vital public good that's provided by government, typically. Access to basic education is a key determinant of equality of opportunity in society. And in China, since 1986, the government has committed to providing 9 years of basic education to every child. And since 2006, they have committed that this education should be free of charge and paid for by government. Except that they know children of migrant workers continue to face great difficulty in gaining access to urban schools. Okay, so this paper is about the challenges, because the government has now committed to reversing these inequalities, and in the third plenum, the party November last year, said that they are committed to providing and gradually bringing everyone into the mainstream of service provision. They spell out some details about music. Okay, so this is, I'm supposed to have 10, 15 minutes? I'll take a little bit longer, 20 minutes. So I'll go through the public policies, the enrollment information that I have seen, and the financing framework, and some policy issues. Okay. Very quickly, education policies for migrant children. Just as the government actually didn't pay much attention to urbanization and issues of local government. But interestingly, in China, I think the government didn't know how fast it was urbanizing because they weren't counting people in the right way until 2000. So in the 1990 census, they continued to count people by their household registration. And so there was very little geographical shift of population because, birth rates don't change over your lifetime. But your actual place may have changed. And only in year 2000, in the 2000 census, they began to count people according to where they're living. So if you're in a place for more than 6 months, you get counted in that place where you're resident for the first time. But in the 1980s, the government didn't pay much attention to the issue of the fact that when people move to the cities, they bring children with them who need to be in urban schools. And I think there were various ad hoc solutions. But by the 1990s, there were enough of them that the government began to formulate policy. So in 1982 was the first policy where they said entitlement to compulsory education is based on hukou place. So you're supposed to go to school where you're registered. And if you're not going to the school in the district where you're registered, then you need approval from your home government, where you're registered, before you can go and approach the host government for registration, et cetera, et cetera. And essentially, the key phrase is that education entitlement is hukou-based. It means that you have no right to urban education, and urban governments can allow you to enroll, but on a discretionary basis, and you should impose no financial burden on the host government. So the child, i.e. the child pays, should pay for the cost of education. Starting from the turn of the century, Chinese policy changed under the Wen Jiabao, Hu Jintao administration when they started the rural tilt policy, where they wanted to now redistribute resources toward the rural sector and protect farmers' rights. And they also wanted to promote urbanization and industrialization. And so they said, if farmers want to move to cities, their rights in the city should be respected. Okay, so there are a bunch of policies that came out emphasizing this. And by extension, the right of migrants being in the cities extended to their children's right to schooling in the cities, rather than sending them home to the school. So gradually, the policies spelled out supporting migrant farmers, migration of farmers, that children should be included in the local education systems. The planning departments need to take into account the number of migrant children in their district. They should put that into their capital planning, capital spending plans, allocation of teachers and funding, etc. And to protect these migrant children from excessive fees. Okay, so there were complaints of very high fees being charged to these children, and so the government began to take some steps to protecting them. So migrant children gradually gained expanded rights to schooling, and public schools should, whenever possible, admit them, but they should still pay. okay, but they shouldn't pay too much. There shouldn't be expropriations. Okay. Now, in 2006, when the new education law came, it said education is free, will be provided free of charge. First, they said in the rural areas, children should no longer pay any fees at all for primary school. And then a year later, it was extended to the cities. And in the extension to the cities, the 2008 State Council document says free education should be extended also to migrant children who are enrolled in urban schools. Now, there was a big difference. In the rural schools, when they exempted everyone from fees, the central government started to provide subsidies to offset the loss of revenue. In the cities, the urban schools would be covered only by municipal finance. This is a local government issue. So the central government's feeling was that cities are rich, rural governments are poor, so subsidies go to the poor rural governments. But in the meantime, it means that migrant children now have gained the entitlement to compulsory education. In the cities, it's now residence-based. And they have full rights in urban schools, but who is paying? It would have to be the municipal government. Right. So in terms of education policies, there's been a very rapid progression in the last decade, from the turn of the century, that migrant children began to gain rights to urban schools. And you see a lot of progress. There's been a lot of political pressure, I think, put on municipal governments to implement the laws and regulations. So we're now looking at some numbers. There is no census of migrant children and where they're being schooled, but there have been a number of surveys, and scholars have undertaken some studies. The Ministry of Education published a nationwide survey in 2009 and counted up 10 million migrant children enrolled in urban schools. And they said of those kids who are enrolled in urban schools, 80% were in, nearly 80% were in public schools. Now, I skipped over that part. In the 1990s, when the government said, when there are not enough places in public schools for the migrant children, there can be private schools set up, community schools set up by nonprofits to take these kids. And so since the 90s, there's been a growth of migrant schools. They're not financed by the state. They tend to be financed at very low levels. Standards are very much lower than in state schools. And there have been a number of studies looking at achievement of students, and there's a huge gap between those who are in public schools and those who are in these private schools, the private schools. Now, of course, China has some very elite private schools that are training all these kids who are scoring at the top of the chart for the world. But by and large, the private schools for migrant children are and so there's, people who do want to put their kids in state schools whenever possible. The Family Planning Commission did a sample survey of 5 cities. They also found that virtually everybody's enrolled, it should be. 69% in public schools and 25% in private schools, and 6% in schools who are children of migrant workers. They make this distinction between these two groups. These are all private schools, but I think they mean that these are the ones that are in borrowed spaces, in factory workshops and so on, rather than more standard schools. In 2010, Shanghai municipality announced that they have achieved 100% placement of migrant children in the city. Okay, so very remarkable, very impressive progress in those 10 years. it looks like mission was accomplished. But if you look at it, then you can mobilize some counter evidence to show that, well, maybe not right. Okay, the surveys are counting kids who are enrolled in urban schools. If you look at how many kids there should be, who should be enrolled. So I put the census data for these cities, just a few magnets of migrant workers. Shanghai is in Guangzhou, Ningbo in Shenzhen province, Chengdu. And this is the number of this is their population in the 2010 census, except for Shanghai, which is 2012 data. This is number of migrants they have. Now, this column is simply taking the national average of kids enrolled in basic education divided by the total population. It's 11.1%. Okay, that's just saying 150 million kids in compulsory education divided by 1.34 billion. And take the migrant population, multiply by 11%, and you get that number. And in each city, I simply multiply by 11%. And these are the numbers. These are the reported enrollments by the various surveys and by some newspaper articles. Okay. And there's a huge gap between these. Now, I think Emily and everybody else who looks at migrants and education know that migrants often leave their kids at home in villages to be cared for. So this is another set of data where this is looking at the migrant population and the proportion of children aged 0 to 14 and how it's dropped over the years, for which we have census data and 5 million samples. Now, of course, part of this drop is the family planning policy, one-child family policy. But this is much steeper than the overall population. Okay. In the 2010 census, in the overall population, there were kids 0 to 14 were 17% of the total population. For migrants, they were just over 10%. So there's a gap here. And if you look at urban enrollment in primary schools to the national total enrollment in primary schools, you see a gap here. Okay, remember in 2010, 50% of the population is urban. But urban primary school enrollment is only 31%. And we know that actually in the rural areas, people are not just having one child. The family planning policy is implemented more loosely. And so you would expect that they have slightly higher birth rates than in urban areas. And so there are a bunch of missing children here. And then you have people who are estimating what are called left behind children. These are kids who are living in the countryside without parents, and actually a very significant proportion are living alone, which is quite surprising. So, and it's been growing. This one, I think it's probably too high. This just came out. National Confederation of Women said that there are now 61 million left behind children. But OECD thought it was 36. I would tend to think it's somewhere in the 30s. Okay, what's happening? So there's clearly a gap between the number of kids who should be in urban school and the ones who are actually enrolled. And so this is the education policy. The fiscal system, when you look at who is responsible for providing education, in China it is the local government at the grassroots level, and that's county and district since 2000. And basic education is the single biggest expenditure on the county level budgets. On average, typically about 1/4 of their total budgetary expenditures go to education. And they range between 20 and 30%. And until early 2000s, there were no central transfers to help local governments pay for education. And so, rich places could spend a lot more on education than poor places, and there are huge regional disparities. And the adjustments were all on the supply side. I like this picture. Came from a newspaper, I think in 2008. In some rural schools, kids have to bring a desk at the beginning of the school year if you want to sit at a desk. And so this is in Hubei, which is by far not the poorest place. So the legacies of this framework is that city governments, municipal governments, don't want to take on more students than they have to. Okay? So in the 1980s and 1990s, when the budget was collapsing in China, nobody had money. Local governments were left on their own. Central government just, said, you do whatever you can, and gave them. I just turned this off. City governments were facing, this rapidly growing population of kids who need places, and they looked around to find a way to curb the growth in demand. And Hukou is this very convenient and foolproof lever they could use. Everybody has a Hukou. Show me your Hukou. Okay, you're in, you're out. Right. This was a very convenient way to exclude the new markets. And nobody intervened to protect the rights of the migrants. And so it continued, and continued, and continued. I think this is the last slide now. So we have to go back. So that's the legacy. And now, even though cities are much richer, they also see that their schools are much better than the rural schools. And, I've had the officials tell me, look, if we open the door to everybody, it's not going to be the workers, the migrant workers who enroll their kids. They're going to bring their cousins and their cousins' cousins and their neighbors' kids to the cities to get them enrolled. We can't have this kind of open door policy that we can't afford it. So they're talking about, we don't want benefit migration. We want people to migrate for jobs, and we don't want them to migrate to get better services. Well, in fact, over the last 10 years, the financing model for basic education has changed dramatically. I should hurry up. So let me just say, central government is now paying for 40 to 50% of national expenditure on basic education, according to my calculations, which is based on incomplete data. They're paying for 40 to 50%. So the question is, why don't they just pay 100%? Right? Why are cities complaining? Well, the transfers, the 40 to 50% that they're paying are entirely going to the central and western provinces and going to rural schools. Very, very little goes to urban schools. So all the transfers miss the migrant kids completely. It's paying for those migrant kids to stay home to be schooled, but not for them to come to these schools. And if you look at who's getting the migrants, who's going to have to pay, they are the burden is very unequally distributed. We have Wong in Pearl River Delta. 71% of their enrolled kids are migrants. 45% in Huashan, also in Pearl River Delta. Ningbo, 42%. Beijing, 40%. Hangzhou, 39%, and so on. Okay. These are all coastal, rich places that are having the very burden of the migrants, and they're not getting any transfers. Okay, here's what they're spending already on their budget. And they don't they're not particularly keen to spend more on education for migrant children if they don't have to. Okay, so the government has announced that it's going to provide services gradually to everybody. So let's think about the cost of absorbing, so 270 million people in cities without rights to services. If they are to include them, what does that mean? There's an overhang of migrant children. That may be 15 to 20 million of them. And equivalent to 30 to 50% of the current urban enrollment. So huge expansion. Migrants in social insurance programs, 25% of them are enrolled, less than 25%, compared to 85% in the local population in cities. So there's a huge gap in extended coverage. If you look at the coverage, there's a rural medical insurance scheme for all farmers, but it's funded at a much lower level. I think the current funding is about 350 to 400 grand per person per year, compared to the thousands of them in the urban health schemes, health insurance schemes, and the rural pensions are 60 grand per month per person. That's just a little bit of social relief. It's not really a pension, a living pension, compared to thousands in cities. So the gap is quite large, and the numbers will be quite large. If just to look at migrant children alone, budgetary expenditure on compulsory education is now 7% of the national budget, and 12.7% of the central government budget goes to basic education. Total enrollment was 50 million in urban compulsory education. Additional costs for education alone would be 150 to 250 billion in central transfers, and additional 50 to 80%. So education itself is not that big a deal. They say easily absorbed. Central government can provide this. The central government budget is something like $3.5 trillion a year. So 200 billion is nothing. But it's more the pensions, the healthcare that are much bigger items. And so if you look at what they say in the third plan, everybody expected that they might move quickly on Hukou, and they didn't do it. And a lot of people were disappointed. I wasn't surprised, because what they say is that they will promote the absorption into urban citizenship, but services steadily extend full coverage of basic urban public services to all permanent residents and fully integrate into urban housing and social security for all settled rural migrants. Okay. They're saying that education, we're going to move on, more quickly. But the other things, social security, which includes health insurance, we're going to move more slowly, and only for those who have gained Hukou status in the cities, rather than all permanent residents. This includes non-Hukou. This is a very clear distinction, because education is affordable, healthcare, pensions are very, very expensive, and they are going to move much more slowly. And the government commits, in Beijing, commits to linking transfers to absorbing the rural migrants into citizenship. Okay. So in order to make significant change to current policy, I would advise them to do these following things. Go back to the principles. Review the principles of public service provision. What do you want? You want to provide access to everyone, fairness of access. You want to provide them efficiently, cost effectively, and you need to worry about affordability. Can the budget afford it? And within that, a very important part is cost containment. Do you have a way of containing the cost, especially for healthcare and pension costs? You have to have a way of containing so that the costs don't just keep going. In the United States, we should be much more mindful of this than other people. these three things. China needs to do much more essential research to know what the situation is, because it varies so much from one place to another. And they should probably come up with some minimum cost packages for these services and make some projections. They've been building all these new schools in the countryside, to fix the 1990s problem of not having enough services in the rural sector. They've been pumping all this money into the countryside, giving them money to build schools. All these spanking new schools that are empty and closed because the kids have moved to the cities. There are fewer kids there. Enrollments have been dropping very rapidly in rural schools. And they're just shutting down these schools. And a lot of wasted money. We need to do better against this. And projections of economic growth and urbanization. Because every city you go to, they say, oh, we expect to double our size in 10 years, 20 years, whatever. Well, maybe not. Not all cities will keep growing. And they should try disseminating some pilots. There's some very interesting one in Shanghai. We can't talk about it. And look at some international best practices and move slowly. But we can't move too slowly because the cost of perpetuating, the cost of doing nothing is too high. The current system has these inequalities that makes it socially unsustainable. There are all these social problems with left behind children that are coming to the fore. You have the inefficiency in the labor market that I mentioned. And then you have emerging labor shortages. And if you want to have more labor in the cities, in the factories, you need to make it easier for people to stay and settle permanently. Thank you.
First of all, I want to thank the authors and Julie for inviting me to discuss Professor Wong's paper. I'm a big fan of Professor Wong's work on public finance, and I consider her the best scholar on Chinese public finance. So it's my great pleasure to read and discuss her paper. My remarks are very short. I just have two general questions. I have those questions in mind while reading this paper. The first question is, so Professor Wong's argument is that this is a money issue. Cannot provide education, basic education for migrant children because we have money to do so. My first question is this really only a money issue? I can think of 4 reasons why providing education for migrants or the children can be good for money purposes. First of all, if you provide education, then they will come to your city and then they will stay longer. As you showed, they can stay more than 9 years or 10 years, they can get a peak of their productivity, and that's good for growth. It's good for GDP growth revenue in your city, so that's good for them. Second of all, if you provide education for migrants and also their children, they are highly educated, their skills will go up, and that's also good for the GDP growth in your city or in the province. Third of all, you compete with other places, other cities, other provinces. If you provide education for those migrants and their children, you can attract the best migrants, and that's also good. And lastly, in education, marginal cost is very low. Like if you have built the infrastructure, you have the school, adding 1 pupil, 2 pupils, 3 pupils, the cost is very, very low, the marginal cost. And also my impression, so when I was in China, when I was in elementary school in China, I remember I was in the baby boom generation, so we have about 60 or 70 pupils in each class. It's a very large class, very crowded. But with the one-child policy being enforced, and also with the population growth declining, now, like my nephew, I talked to her and him, and then he said only about 20 or 30 pupils in each class, which means that there's a large space to be provided for those migrants and children, which means since you have already built the infrastructure, why don't you just add those pupils for the children of the migrants? So I think that, which means providing education can be good for money. And the question, the puzzle is this, right? So if it's good for money, like I said, why can those leaders in China figure it out, right? So if they know this, why still they cannot provide education for migrant workers? One explanation you might say because they're stupid. That might be true, but in my impression of talking to them, they're very smart. They're smarter than me, and they don't have PhDs, but they're very smart. So that's very positive, right? So if in the long term, providing education for those migrants can be good for their growth and also for their own political career, why do they do this? Right, that's my first question. Second question. Where is politics, right? As a political scientist, after reading the paper and also the presentation, where is politics? Where is the political processes? Where is the bargaining? Where is the interest groups? And all those kind of stuff, fun stuff that political scientists have been interested in. Where are those? Talking about education, having a 2-year-old daughter start to pay attention to public schools in Philadelphia, and there are a lot of news about public schools, and it's all about politics. It's about local politics, bad politics. We don't have a very good public school district in Philadelphia, and people blame the politics. And talking about immigration, right? In this country, in the whole United States, people talk about politics, but it's not about money issues, it's about politics, right? So where is the politics in China, right? So, and who are the political actors involved in this whole process in providing education for migrants? So what kind of a role does residents play in China? Do they demand, for example, the exclusion of those children of migrants? Because, for example, if I'm a teaching resident, do they think that I don't want my children to be in the same school with the children of migrants? Is that the case? And then how do they demand this? China is not democracy, so we don't have, competitive elections in China. So if they have this demand, how do they translate the demand into public policies and how does it work? And then what's the demand of migrants? If there's a significant number of migrants in each city, what do they do? Do they go on street? Do they provide letters to the mayors, for example, to express their concerns about this? So I just want to know more about the political processes and the bargaining behind all of this. And that's it. I really enjoyed it.
I would love for you to take a few minutes to answer Yuhua's questions, in part because they were my questions too. And then we can open the floor up for a wider debate.
Okay, yeah, no, it's always good to get some other disciplines' perspective on the issue. So thank you for those comments. Now, on your first point about, should there be some cities competing for migrant workers, especially now that there are shortages, reported shortages. As an economist, I don't believe that there are shortages. It just means they're not paying enough. Why don't they compete by providing school places? We did come actually to one school in a new industrial zone that we take all of migrant children. They just need to meet certain criteria. Because we, as part of the luring investors to come to this new zone, they were telling the potential investors that they would find it easier to attract workers because they have schooling for their children, for their kids. So yes, there is some of that going on. But in the same breath, the same principle said to us that, but we can't let just anybody come because they'll bring their cousins and their neighbors' kids and so on and so forth. So that they do still impose certain criteria. But yes, there is some competition going on, and as the labor shortages get more intense, this may be used increasingly as a tool for attracting investors. Not so much to, for all these social goods and social benefits that you're alluding to, but simply to attract investors. Now, in your comment on falling birth rates and smaller classes in city schools, I assume you're referring to. Well, there's a scale issue. Cities have gotten much bigger. So even though yes, the families that were in the cities, that have been in the cities are having fewer children, there's still not that many spaces in those schools compared to the new demand of the migrant children coming in. But also there's the urban renewal where neighborhoods are being torn down. along with the old schools, and new stuff gets built on top. And then you're talking about whole new populations and demands for school places. And that still leaves up the migrants, I think, by and large. In terms of the bargaining, so who are the champions for migrants? Well, sadly, I think there are very few champions. And the upturn in their fortunes after 2000 came from the rural group that finally won the argument that the rural areas and farmers and agriculture needed now some redistribution in their favor after 15 years of industrialization. And you see some benefits coming through that way. But migrants, by and large, cannot go out and assemble and march. If they do, they'll get rounded up and sent home. It's the middle class who are gathering and marching and protesting in the cities. Usually protect their rights, and their rights will include not sending their kids to school with the migrant kids. And this is a worldwide phenomenon. It's not just Chinese. You see Europe, convulsing in anti-immigrant sentiment because they don't want their kids going to school, with people with foreign accents, and they don't want to be sharing the welfare benefits with people who are not part of the original population. And this is exactly what's troubling with anti-migrant or social issue. Money is only part of it, but money is pretty important too.
Could I ask a really basic question of clarification? It goes back, to the first point you made. You began by estimating that about a third of the population in China's urban areas don't have hukou status where they live, and therefore they're outside of the whole system. And it occurred to me, given that the urban population has quintupled over the last, several decades, I guess if I'd been asked to guess, I suppose I would have guessed that 2/3 of the population didn't have hukou status. The figures suggest to me that a very high proportion of migrants have got hukou status.
Yes.
So that's two questions. A, how did that happen? And B, why is it that some were able to get it and a sizable portion have not been able to get it? That's the kind of background question. I ask out of ignorance, but it seems important.
Well, it is important, and this is something that I have not actually done much in exploration of. If you get a high-level job, if you're a university graduate, this is something that's changed over time. In the 1990s, when I was working in Beijing, actually at the end of the 90s, I went down to Shenzhen to talk to some high-tech firms down there about what they were doing there. They were actually, I met a senior executive who was very confident that Shenzhen is going to be the tech capital of China in a very short time. And the reason was they were a new city, right? They were growing very rapidly. They were offering hukou to everybody who came to work in the high-tech industry. And they said, Shanghai and Beijing were not doing that. And they said, go to Shanghai, talk to people in the software industry, and you will find that the average age of their software program is 45, which is ancient. And ours is 20-something. And so we're going to take over because we have this flexibility. Well, Shanghai and Beijing have obviously somehow, somewhere along the way, learned this lesson. Toward the end of I think this was year 2000, just before I left the World Bank. It's that recent that they started offering hukou to university graduates if they want to enter. But so if you have a high end, you get a hukou. If you graduate from a Beijing university, and if you can show that you have a job, you found a job in Beijing, you can get a hukou fairly easily. And I know at least one person who came to Oxford on a postdoc to spend some time with me, and we talked about his hukou. He's from Shanghai, and he graduated from Tsinghua. He said, I have a Beijing hukou because I'm paying some fake company in Beijing, a few thousand yuan a year, to pretend that I have a job with them, so that I keep my Beijing hukou. Because if I leave Beijing without a job, then I might lose the opportunity. So there must be lots of people out there with fake companies. And so Beijing gets richer, Shanghai gets richer. So in answer to your question is that yes, some people have gained hukou status. They're probably at the higher end of the income spectrum, technology spectrum, education spectrum. And it's the middle and lower having
Just follow up on the question about the hukou. It sounds from what you're saying as if the discretion as to,
it's entirely up to the city.
so it's entirely local discretion. This is so interesting to me.
And the smaller and medium cities have, adopted a policy, many of them, many years ago, to if you come in and invest, in job creation or in just buying assets. I think more recently, because everybody's building real estate to sell and make money. If you come in and buy an apartment for, more than X, 100,000 yuan, you can get a local hukou. But you see, in the medium and small cities, and the third plan calls for the smaller cities to just free up and eliminate the hukou distinction. And their hukou is not worth so much, because their education, their health benefits, and their pensions are probably not much better than, not as perhaps not.
I think about the sort of territoriality, the subnational territoriality of welfare states as they developed in Europe. And, at a very early stage, particularly in Northern and Western Europe, these questions of residence and which municipality you belong to were really, really important for the municipalities, in part because they didn't want to give or leave or other sorts, whatever other benefits were available to people who weren't members of their municipality for exactly the same reasons that you're talking about. But sort of, at least from the 19th century onward, the sort of scaling of territoriality of the social state becomes much more national in scale. So that questions of membership really become questions of membership in the national polity more than in the subnational polity. So it's really interesting to me to see that in China.
Well, with increasing population mobility, many things that used to be local public goods have now, acquired more, inter-regional.
And yet you still have this very localized discretion over who gets to be sort of called a member of the polity or not.
Right.
Like Switzerland.
Yeah. No, and this is a complex issue for public finance, because it's who's going to pay for what was traditionally divided by the kind of the benefit payment. Whoever benefits should be paid. That would be a fairness principle. And you define public goods by this public good should be paid locally, and that should be paid regionally and then nationally by how widespread the benefits are and how much spillover there is in these. And as mobility increases, and as we have e-commerce and so on, territoriality changes, and so new issues come out about redesigning preventive mechanisms and taxing. Are you calling?
You can call.
Is the Hoku just city-based, or is there a neighborhood dimension at all? I was just wondering, that what the housing looks like in terms of the migrants coming in? I mean, in the U.S. city, the public school system is internally inequitable as well as nationally. And I guess I was wondering if the migrants are living, the way you describe the schools, it makes it sound like the migrants and the citizens are very well integrated inside the cities. And I was just wondering how that plays out.
Well, I mean, I think the existence of the hukou system opens the door to lots of ways to use it to discriminate. Okay, so there's job discrimination in many cities where certain job categories are not open to non-local. I think that's been lessening over time, but still exists. So the migrants, you have the migrant elite that have, that can make their way into the system easily. But increasingly, actually, there's an argument that many migrants who are excluded have university degrees. Until recently, that was a very small number. Now, increasingly, that's a larger number, and many of those people are finding themselves at the bottom of the heap as well. Now, migrants often don't have the right to buy in the city. But prior, that's not a big issue because most of them can't afford to buy. So they're not yet, at a point where they should be protesting about the right to buy, but they don't have the right to buy in many cases. And they tend to be at the lower end of the income spectrum, and so they tend to, and because they're coming often without their families, many of them live in dormitories. Factories will have dormitories. So when you read about Foxconn, that is stuff for Apple, iPods and iPhones and so on, those workers live in dormitories because they're predominantly single. They might be married and have families back home, but they're in the factories working living as singles. The construction workers is almost entirely migrant workforce. They live on the construction sites. And others tend to go and rent in these migrant enclaves. And there's an interesting phenomenon called, what are they called? Changzhongs? Changzhongcun, how do you translate that? Villages within cities. Villages within cities. I came upon this about 5 or 6 years ago when I stumbled into one. This is on the outskirts of cities where the city expands and takes in more of the rural counties surrounding them. Right? And farmers don't have individual rights to land. Agricultural land is collectively owned, and it's the village leaders who negotiate the sale of the land, etc. That's the big window for corruption. But the land that has been allocated to farmers to build their houses on, so there's farmland and then there's land that's allocated for farmers to build houses on. And they have quasi-private rights, ownership over those pieces of land. And very often when the city absorbs the village, there will be a little pocket of this Zaizibi, the farmers' homeland, let's call them, which hasn't been sold, and farmers still have it. And what they do is, in an expanding city with housing shortage for migrant workers, they will go and build 3, 4, 5-story apartment blocks, usually very cheaply, and rent out the rooms to migrant workers. And then so there'll be shops and people living there. And they don't have secure ownership rights because there's no private ownership right to farmers. And that's why they don't want to invest in building any expensive and permanent structures. So kind of quasi temporary structures. So those are the pockets where farmers live. And there's also a big campaign to clean out those urban villages.
You mentioned the significant local debt that municipalities had to take on as a result of the mandates for education. Could you say a little bit more about who the holders of the debt are? And is there a possibility of default on the debt? So what happens in those cases? I'm thinking the old communist structure, of course, allowed for absorption of that in various ways, and I don't actually know what's happening in terms of debt and financing right now.
Well, that's a very big topic now, where local government debt is, they've been doing these nationwide audits to find out how much it is, because nobody really knew. And nobody really nobody is very confident that the number that they came up with is really the number. Right? There's been a lot of stuff going on that the government doesn't know about. And this is because China's been working with an intergovernmental division of revenues and responsibilities that's unworkable. And yet somehow it's worked. Right? China's been growing 10% a year and getting richer and so on. By pushing a lot of activities off budget and under the carpet and out of purview of central government. And local government debt is one of these. Education debt is just a tiny piece of it. There's building these highways, building the subways, building water systems and so on, all costs a lot of money up front. And guess what? The law says local governments are not allowed to borrow. U.S. cities borrow money, and occasionally a city goes bankrupt because they borrow too much and they can't repay. Well, Chinese cities are not allowed to borrow, but of course they do. They have. That's how they've been able to build infrastructure. And in fact, they build world-class infrastructure. China is one of the most efficient countries in the world in getting stuff into the global supply chain. This is a big country with just one coastline, et cetera, because they've invested an enormous amount in infrastructure, largely by local governments, largely by borrowing.
That's what I'm asking. Who are they borrowing from?
Under the radar. Well, they borrow from the banks. They borrow from the banks, they borrow from the people. And it's the banks' stuff that they can count. It's the stuff they owe to people that they can't quite count out. And that's very risky. They were handsome people before.
Yeah, I wanted to ask briefly, but what is the employer's perspective on migrant labor?
Whose perspective?
The employer's perspective. Because it seems to me they want to keep the labor costs down. They're very happy to have cheap labor. But then, on the other hand, the long-term interest might be to grant social benefits to migrant labor as well, because that will be the base of consumption in the future.
Well, I think there's a match between the kind of labor and the kind of employer. I will tell you that Foxconn doesn't care whether the labor stays 3 years or 10 years or 20 years, because they're looking for low repetitive skills. You can get skilled up for what they want you to do probably within 6 months, and you might not get any better beyond 6 months. A few maybe, but the majority won't. But there are upstream things, other things that might benefit people with more skills or industrial skills. But you will attract the kind of industries depending on what you have on offer. China has on offer large pools of low-skilled labor at very low cost. And that's the kind of industry that goes to China. But if China wants to move up the value chain and start producing higher tech stuff, higher value added stuff, then China needs to scale up. And the government is talking a lot about that. And I think changing the ecosystem is a necessary step in part of this upward progression.
I had a question about sort of the changing nature of the central state funding. You suggested that, at least initially, when the central state got involved, it was heavily favored towards the western, more rural district. I was wondering if the state saw itself as having an interest in actually bringing those educational systems, making up for the fact that they are so far behind the urban centers. And I was wondering if you do tie funding, central state funding more closely to the migrant workers, wouldn't that be a big shift away from the rural areas and to the more urban areas? I'm just wondering if the state sees itself as having or needing to give disproportionate funding to those rural areas. Now, is that explaining why there's such a big disparity?
Well, I don't know what the motivation was. One can make arguments on both sides of that in distribution.
Well, I guess normatively, do they have an interest in offering more investment into rural school systems than they do in urban?
They have to. They have been pumping money into the rural school system. And very rapidly.
So, but and I was just wondering, if you shift that funding structure to tie it more closely to where the migrants actually are, wouldn't that be a shift away from the rural system back towards the urban center?
Well, one of the things I was looking at is if you look at how much money central government is already providing, and think about just rerouting it, from going only to rural schools to follow the kids. You can have them follow the rural kids as they move to the city. It's hard to do for two reasons. One is political. That means taking money from the poor provinces, Gansu, Huizhou, and giving it to Guangdong, giving it to Jiangsu, giving it to Shanghai, and things like that. That doesn't look very good and hard to argue. Two is that the way that they've been giving the money makes it really difficult, and that's why I wasn't able to completely follow the money to find out how much is going to education, because it's given as general wage support, through these big programs, and you don't know the proportion of wages that are accounted for by teachers. But in any case, even if we could, until they're ready to say, okay, when your enrollment falls below this threshold, we withdraw the money from this school, from this teacher, and start laying off rural teachers. You can't move the money. So this money is not very movable. And I think, in China, there's just no tradition of laying off public employees.
I had a question I guess it's related both to education, but also to healthcare and pensions, which, as you mentioned, are a bigger hit on the budget. Do you see any resistance at a sort of ideological level to the idea of tying social rights to the individual rather than to the sector or the region in China? I mean, you talk about the idea of having education funding follow the student pool. That's a very individualized operationalization of the idea of a social right to education.
No, I'm just talking about how to operationalize.
And I mean, I'm still sort of working through in my mind whether here in the U.S. we're comfortable with that level of individualization of social rights. I'm not sure that we are. I mean, for a whole variety of reasons, we like to give money to places.
It's much easier to administer.
Right. But I think also there are sort of ideological reasons why we don't like, we don't like giving money to poor people. Because we distrust poor people. That's sort of a core part of our ideology. And I'm just wondering whether there's an element to the sort of, official ideology of equality in China that is resistant to the idea of giving resources to support the social rights of individuals versus places.
And I think, I don't know, Emily would agree, there is a great, the Chinese are just like everybody else and say, we don't want to give money to the poor provinces because it will be less productive. Capital is less productive in the poor provinces. That's why they're poor. And if we just keep money from, they say, if we keep money from the fast horses and give it to the slow horses, then the whole country slows down. But there's also a very strong strain of everybody's equal. This is kind of leftover of communism. Not much is left over, actually. But there is a belief that everybody is equal, and everybody should have, well, I haven't heard anybody say they should have the same services, but there's a strain about equality.
So the idea of having the money follow the child might not be totally out of bounds.
But the rural governments will do all they can to keep the child counted, whether the child is there or not.
Right.
And so because the money is actually given to, some money is given to rural schools based on enrollment. There are lots of fake, ghost students. And then money is for paid to teachers, and there are ghost teachers in the countryside. Because you want to keep the money coming. In fact, I went to visit one county that had just been caught falsifying enrollment figures in rural schools and ghost teachers and so on. And when we asked them about it, they said, "Oh, yeah, that was really unfortunate." So the head of the Education Bureau had to be reassigned. But really, it wasn't his fault. He was just told to do this by the higher-ups, which is probably true. The mayor of the county register.
I guess that raises the whole issue of like, how confident are you in any of this data? Or is there a ranking in terms of how reliable some of the data you use and how unreliable others are? I mean, all the ghosts.
Well, I think that the budget figures are pretty confident. In terms of estimates, not precise figures, the migrant children figures are pretty soft. And the enrollment figures are all pretty soft. And I looked at a bunch of these reports and surveys about enrollment of migrant children in public schools. So there's this big emphasis on getting them into Beverly Public School. Everybody reports something close about 70%. And 70% is this magical figure in China that basically achieved is 70%. So I'm very suspicious.
I was curious about, I was thinking about other factors that might be preventing further inclusion of the potential migrant students that you were mentioning. And I guess one thing that I know was been mentioned a few years ago, I don't know if the policy has been changed, but it was the policies related to where students can take the college entrance exams. And that was a barrier for kids staying in city schools beyond a certain age, but I don't know if that's still an issue.
Well, they're talking about changing it. So the current policy is, in order to go to university, you have to take the college entrance exam in your home registration, the home province in most cases. And so kids have to go home basically for middle school and senior middle school because the curriculum is different across provinces. So you can't just jump in from phase two and sit for the exam. You're probably not do as well as you might. So and also there's we're talking about, I just focus on basic education, which is through junior middle school. I said nothing about senior middle schools. In many cities, senior high schools do not admit migrant children. Period. So you can't go on. And government policy has focused on the basic education, and they haven't really done very much. I haven't really looked at senior high schools. You know what the situation?
Yeah, I mean, I had understood that in a lot of places that kids were having to go home,
They go home.
but I don't know.
Yeah, the other thing I haven't mentioned is that the cost of picking a child in the city is often too high. You know, there's all these fees, even though since 2008 they've been eliminated, there's still very high fees to get into schools. And you're talking about people who are low income levels. It's very difficult. And then housing is so expensive that they tend to cram together and share flats. And it's hard to find the economy. So even if they eliminate the hookah problem, it'll take a long time for, I think, all the kids to be fully moving.
The other issue that seems like, I mean, it's been sort of alluded to in the way that rural schools are getting funded for kids staying, but a lot of, in response, I think, to the migration and to demographic trends in rural areas, there are many kids are going to boarding schools pretty young now, right? And so there's
That's another policy.
just kind of a pull factor in the rural communities, I would guess. So even if parents want their kids with them, there are these boarding school options in rural communities that don't require probably the level of resources that it would require for them to have kids with them in the cities. It seems like that, I mean, I think it's a conundrum because it seems like a good policy. I mean, given the situation, one needs to accommodate those children, but it also seems like a real barrier to getting them integrated.
There's been a school consolidation program where they shut down a lot of the remote schools under the guise of, under the argument that bigger schools are better, and concentrating kids in the towns and the cities, in which case they have to fall. I did a little consulting project for the UK government on education in remote regions, and it seems to me they've invested nothing in training teachers for pastoral care. You know, teachers are trained to stand up in the classroom and teach. Well, what happens after school when you have all these kids concentrated in dormitories? There's nothing for them to do. You know, the teachers who, they do assign teachers for nighttime duty, but that's just to keep order. So you have another big social problem building. You know, you have all these kids congregating with very little guidance. Very few activities to keep them productively engaged. So they do video games and other things.
They'd probably be doing that anyway.
They would
All right. Thank you all for coming.